10 November 1947. Charleroi, Belgium. Dawn had barely broken when the courtyard of the military barracks filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. The air was cold, thick with anticipation. Boots scraped against gravel, metal clicked into place. A line of condemned men stood facing a wall, their breath visible in the pale morning light. Among them was a man who had once wielded power behind desks, in offices far from gunfire. Now, his hands trembled uncontrollably. His face had lost all color. Guards had to support him, as his legs refused to move. This was not the image of authority he had once projected. Hours earlier he had begged, whispered prayers, broken words. But now, there was no audience left to persuade, no system left to hide behind. His name was Louis Collard, and on this morning, the system he helped build was about to judge him in return. Louis Collard was born on 9 August 1915 inches, the industrial town of Ans, in the French-speaking region of Wallonia, Belgium. His earliest memories were shaped not by peace, but by the echoes of the First World War. The conflict had scarred the country deeply, leaving behind razrushid cities, fractured communities, and a generation raised on stories of occupation and survival. In this environment, Collard grew up absorbing a world where authority, order, and national identity were no longer abstract ideas, but urgent necessities. As Belgium struggled through the interwar years, economic hardship and political instability became part of daily life. The Great Depression tightened its grip, fueling unemployment, resentment, and fear. For many young men of Collard's generation, the future felt uncertain, even fragile. Stability seemed distant, and traditional institutions appeared incapable of restoring control. Collard stood out early for his discipline and intelligence. He was methodical, precise, and drawn to structure. But beneath that calm exterior was a quiet ambition, a desire not just to belong, but to rise. It was this combination that would define him. He was not driven by chaos, but by the promise of order. And in a time when Europe was drifting toward extremes, that desire for order would soon find a very specific direction. By the early 1930s, Belgium was no longer a country at ease with itself. Economic collapse had shaken public confidence, and political divisions deepened with each passing year. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, movements promising renewal and discipline began to attract those searching for clarity. Among them was Rex, a movement founded by Léon Degrelle, initially rooted in Catholic publishing, but rapidly transforming into a political force built on nationalism, authority, and rejection of parliamentary democracy. For Louis Collard, Rex offered something more than ideology. It offered direction. The movement spoke of moral regeneration, of a unified state cleansed of corruption, communism, and liberalism. Its language was simple but powerful. It reduced complexity into certainty. And for a young man who valued structure and precision, that certainty was deeply appealing. Collard did not join as a passive supporter. He immersed himself in the machinery of the movement. He worked in propaganda, helping shape narratives that framed Rex not as an alternative, but as a necessity. His ability to organize, to control information, and to maintain discipline quickly brought him to the attention of the leadership. As Rex grew increasingly aligned with fascist regimes across Europe, drawing inspiration from Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, its tone hardened. Moderation disappeared. Loyalty became absolute. Opposition was no longer debated. It was identified, categorized, and prepared for removal. For Collard, this was not a warning sign. It was confirmation. The world, as he saw it, required control. And Rex was becoming the instrument through which that control could be enforced. When war came, that belief would no longer remain theoretical. It would be tested, expanded, and ultimately weaponized. On 10 May 1940, the German invasion of Belgium unfolded with overwhelming speed. Within weeks, the country collapsed. By 28 May, resistance had ended, and the occupation began. What followed was not only a military defeat, but a transformation of power. Authority shifted quietly at first, through decrees, offices, and new chains of command. It was in this environment that Louis Collard's role began to expand. As the occupation authorities consolidated control, Léon Degrelle returned to reorganize Rex under German supervision. Collard, already trusted within the movement, was elevated into a position that placed him at the center of coordination between Belgian collaborators and German intelligence structures. He was no longer simply managing propaganda. He was shaping the internal mechanisms that allowed collaboration to function efficiently. Operating from offices in Brussels and Charleroi, Collard built networks. Information flowed through him: reports, names, suspicions. His work connected directly with the apparatus of repression, particularly the Gestapo and the SD. These were not distant institutions. They were partners. Through them, Collard gained both influence and protection. By 1943, the structure shifted again. De Grelle left for the Eastern Front with the Waffen-SS, leaving a vacuum behind. Collard stepped into it. Though not always officially declared, his authority over the civilian branch of Rex became decisive. Orders passed through him. Decisions carried his weight. Under his direction, Rex intensified its role in enforcing occupation policies. Propaganda was no longer enough. Surveillance expanded. Informants were recruited. Lists were compiled: names of resistance sympathizers, political opponents, individuals marked as threats. Raids followed. Arrests became routine. The line between administration and enforcement disappeared. Within this system, a paramilitary unit emerged as a key instrument, Brigade B. It operated with a degree of autonomy, but under Collard's influence, its actions aligned closely with the broader objectives of repression. Members of this unit participated in operations alongside German forces, targeting civilians suspected of resistance activity. The methods were systematic. Doors were broken before dawn. Individuals were taken without explanation. Entire neighborhoods learned to remain silent. As 1944 approached, the war began to turn. Allied forces advanced through France, and inside Belgium, resistance networks grew more active. Sabotage increased. Communication lines were disrupted. The occupation authorities responded with escalation. Retaliation became policy. It was in this atmosphere charged with fear, uncertainty, and a growing sense of collapse that one of the most defining events of Collard's wartime role took place. On 17 August 1944, Oswald Engelbin, the Rexist mayor of Charleroi, was ambushed and killed by resistance fighters, along with members of his family. The attack was swift, but its consequences unfolded with calculated precision. Within hours, orders for retaliation were issued. Collard was present when the response was organized. The target was not the perpetrators of the attack, it was the surrounding population. In the nearby town of Courcelles, civilians were identified, gathered, and accused of supporting resistance activities. There was no investigation in any meaningful sense. The process was immediate. Names were selected. People were taken from their homes: teachers, workers, local officials, even a priest. Some were executed that same evening. Others were held overnight, confined in uncertainty, separated from their families. There were no formal charges, no opportunity for defense. Only the growing awareness of what was to come. At dawn on 18 August, the remaining prisoners were brought outside and lined against a wall. The procedure was methodical. Orders were given. Positions were assigned. Witnesses later described Collard as present, overseeing the operation, maintaining control. 27 civilians were killed. The event would later be known as the Courcelles Massacre. It stood as one of the most severe acts of reprisal during the occupation of Belgium. It did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern, an escalation driven by the belief that fear could restore control where authority was slipping. But by this point, control was already beginning to fracture. In early September 1944, Allied forces entered Belgium. The occupation collapsed rapidly. Structures that had once appeared stable disintegrated within days. Rex, dependent on German power, lost its foundation almost overnight. Collard fled. Alongside other collaborators, he moved eastward into Germany, attempting to stay ahead of advancing forces. The networks he had built no longer offered protection. Communication broke down. Authority dissolved into survival. For years, he had operated within a system that rewarded loyalty and efficiency. Now, that system no longer existed. The roles, the titles, the structure, all of it had vanished. What remained were the consequences of actions that could no longer be concealed behind administration or ideology. After the collapse of Nazi control in Belgium, Louis Collard moved through a Europe that was no longer structured by the authority he had once relied on. Borders tightened. Networks dissolved. What had once been channels of power became obstacles to escape. Alongside other collaborators, he attempted to disappear into the shifting geography of post-war Germany, moving toward the Austrian Alps in search of refuge. But the war had ended, and with it, the protection of anonymity. In February 1946, in the city of Innsbruck, Collard was located by Belgian intelligence agents. He was no longer a figure operating behind offices and directives. He was a fugitive, traveling with a small group that included former SS members and his wife. By that time, he had already been sentenced to death in absentia. The charges were clear: his role in the Courcelles Massacre, his coordination with occupation forces, and his involvement in a series of targeted assassinations during the war. Returned to Belgium under heavy guard, Collard faced a system now rebuilt to judge men like him. During the trial in Charleroi, he appeared physically diminished, thin, tense, often avoiding direct answers. When questioned, he claimed memory loss. Events that had been described in detail by witnesses became, in his words, impossible to recall. He distanced himself from decisions, portraying his role as administrative, secondary, detached. Yet testimony accumulated. Former associates spoke of orders given, meetings attended, decisions made with clarity and intent. The courtroom became a reconstruction of a system he once controlled, this time, without his authority. On 3 August 1946, after weeks of proceedings, the verdict was delivered. Louis Collard was sentenced to death by firing squad. In the months that followed, confined within a cell, his behavior shifted. There were moments of defiance, fragments of arrogance that echoed his past. But they were interrupted by something else: instability, silence, and attempts to escape the outcome he now faced. The structure he had once trusted had disappeared, and now there was nothing left to stand between him and the consequences. The trials that followed the liberation of Belgium extended far beyond a single man. In Charleroi, nearly 100 defendants were brought before the court in what became the largest war crimes trial in the country's history. Testimonies unfolded over weeks, reconstructing a system of collaboration that had once operated in shadows, but now stood exposed in full detail. Names were spoken, actions traced, and responsibilities assigned with precision. For the families of Courcelles, the consequences were permanent. The absence of 27 lives could not be reversed by verdicts or sentences. Streets returned to silence, but memory remained embedded in place homes where doors had been broken, walls where lives had ended. Over time, the massacre became part of Belgium's historical record, not only as an act of retaliation, but as a warning of how quickly authority can turn against the very society it claims to protect. Louis Collard's name did not endure as a symbol of power. It remained instead as a reference point in that record, a reminder that systems built on control and fear ultimately collapse under the weight of their own logic. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not restore what was lost. It only confirms that actions, once set in motion, will always return to their source. This story is not just about one man, but about the choices that shape history in its darkest moments. If you want to explore more untold stories like this where power, ideology, and consequence collide, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because history does not forget, and neither should we.